we will go ahead and get started. This is our Universal Periodic Review webinar, Why and How to Effectively Engage. And thank you everyone for joining. Our first speaker today is Joshua Cooper from the Hawaii Institute for Human Rights. And Joshua, if it's okay with you, I'm going to have you start and talk about what is the UPR.
Okay, I'll definitely start. The Universal Periodic Review is a new instrument at the UN, so it's an honor to be able to share that with everyone today. I hope everyone's doing well across the country. One of the important aspects of the UPR that we'll look at is why it's a valuable tool for us that are working in economic, social, and cultural rights. And what we're going to look at today is how to participate in it. What it does is it's actually set up with the new UN Human Rights Council, and the goal was that every country would have its human rights record reviewed equally. And how that's turned out is in the first cycle, was 2008 till 2012, what happened was every country had 3 hours to be reviewed. The good news is in the second cycle, which we're in right now, is that we've been able to increase that to 3.5 hours. So there's actually more time for more questions and more recommendations, and also for more countries to be able to put more questions forward. So we think it'll actually be a great mechanism for us to be able to utilize in this second turn. Another important part about the UPR is it guarantees that stakeholders can actually participate and have a prominent role in this process. And that's what we are, that everyone who's interested can write reports that actually document the human rights violations, but more importantly, also give recommendations. So that's another important point. The other point is every country is reviewed, and there's the same 3 documents that provide the core content of the UPR review. The first document is what we'll be focusing on today, and that's stakeholder reports and how you engage. So the exciting thing is with the U.S. Human Rights Network, we're all working together to create working groups, and in these working groups we'll create 10-page documents. And what we will do is we'll submit those 10-page documents, and as everybody knows, those are due on September 1st. What will happen with those 10-page documents that are submitted is the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva will take all those documents and make a 10-page document out of it. That will be the first document that is the basis of the discussion that will take place when the U.S. is reviewed in 2015. The second document is the OHCHR, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, also makes a 10-page document based on all the treaties that the U.S. has ratified and all the recommendations that have come out of that, but also anything that a special rapporteur has written about or mentioned, and also specialized agencies, programs, and funds. And they'll make a 10-page report. So that's 20 pages. Then the other document is a 20-page report written by the United States that the government will write. That's why many of us are participating in a UPR consultation next week. And that'll be a 20-page report. The United States will issue its 20-page report in January. So what's important is these 3 documents, the core document of all of our stakeholder submissions, the 10-page document, the 10 pages of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, looking at all the treaty body recommendations and everything else, is the other page, and then the 20-page report from the United States. Those 3 documents will be the basis of the conversation that will take place for 3.5 hours in April, May 2015. What's really important, though, is to look at how broad the UPR is and see what we'll be able to do with that. And as it's talking about on the UPR slide, it will allow us to actually look at anything that's in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the treaties that we've ratified, but also the pledges and promises the United States has made when it ran for the Human Rights Council, which it's sitting on now, that just concluded its June meeting, but also international humanitarian law. So if you look at all of the international instruments and institutions that the U.S. Human Rights Network participates in, this one is the largest opportunity for us to be able to make sure that all the issues that we care about are able to be addressed. And of course, what's really important there is humanitarian law, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights that's under the UDHR. So that's the important part there. The next part I'll cover with the small amount of time I have remaining that allow for more conversation is the 5 phases. The first phase is what we're in now, and that is the preparation. Up until September 1st, we'll be preparing our shadow report and gathering information from civil society and our colleagues around the country to be able to give a real accurate picture of the human rights situation on the ground in our communities across the country. That will be very important and crucial for us to be able to do, and we'll be working on those through the working groups that Mary will get into in the next part of the conversation. The second part is the interaction. With the interaction, that is when we'll actually organize, mainly in Geneva, and be able to make all of our 10-page documents into a concise 1 to 2 page document that covers 3 main points: the issues, the questions for those issues, and then the specific recommendations we would want posed to the United States that would change the policies and practices on the ground in our country. With that 1 to 2 page document, boiling down our 10-page documents we'll be turning in, we then meet with government based on their interests. What governments do with the UPR is they usually ask specific questions over and over again on specific themes. So if it's women's rights, it's mainly Norway. If it's indigenous, it's Kenya, Mexico. And what we'll do is match up the different working groups and the issues that you'll be raising with those governments. We also can coordinate in 2 other places, unfortunately. We can coordinate Washington, D.C. with the embassies, but also with the missions in New York. So we'll be able to talk with them to make sure that all of the issues you raise and the questions you have are guaranteed to be brought up and included in the 3.5-hour review. That's what we'll do between basically September and April until April 2015. The consideration is the really important part. The consideration is the actual review, and as is pointed out there, it's conducted by the UN UPR Working Group. Every country that signs up will actually be able to ask questions to the United States. So what has happened in the second cycle is everyone signed up to ask questions to China, so every country only got 51 seconds. But that's really good because then you get more countries asking questions, which gives us more opportunities. The consideration will be a 3.5-hour review where we can't participate, but an exciting thing we can do is have all of our NGOs host webcast parties so that everyone can see what's going on and be able to watch it in our communities and also on college campuses across the country in 2015. The other part then is there'll be an outcome report from that. What will happen is anything that is said will just be included in this final document. And then we'll then have recommendations. What will be important is we'll have to then put pressure between May and September, and this is really the adoption phase. Let's put pressure on the U.S. government to make sure that they don't reject recommendations that we think are valuable to us. Sometimes the U.S. does reject and doesn't want certain parts to go in, so we will have to make sure we push those. We'll be able to organize that very well in the summer next year, and that'll be our main campaign before the actual adoption at the UN Human Rights Council in September. In September 2015, there will actually be a 1-hour review. The U.S. will have 20 minutes, the states will have 20 minutes, and civil society will have 20 minutes. So there'll be 10 2-minute slots that will allow for any NGO that signs up to be able to speak and document either some of the gains or some of the shortcomings that we still have to focus on. And then, of course, the final phase is implementation. And implementation is where we're going to try to make sure that these recommendations are actually implemented through federal action as well as state action. And that's really where we get to where we are now, sharing our story. So the important part is this first part of preparation. The more that we're able to make sure that we can share our story with the world and tell the world what's actually going on inside the United States will be very valuable. and we'll work together to then produce these 10-page reports that will then be submitted. So that's a brief overview of the 5 phases, and it'll be very important to work through that with you. Next, I think Eric Tars is going to highlight the importance of how he's worked on the right to housing through the UPR, and then we will have Mary talking about next steps and how you'll be able to engage and be involved. I hope that was useful, and I'm also available for any questions or comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Joshua. And everyone will have time for questions at the end. So I turn it over to Eric Tars of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Eric, we can hear you. And if you can let me know when to change the slides, that would be great.
Sure. So I was thinking this morning about how to best approach this concept of trying to use the UPR process to actually make human rights real, and came up with this flashy title of How to Make a Human Right in 10 Easy Steps. However, I will note that all of the steps I'm about to share with you are anything easy. It's purely just a flashy title that belies the actual work that's involved. But with that said, I've tried to break things down just so people can understand how we at the National Law Center have approached using these international human rights mechanisms and standards as part of our advocacy. Go ahead, Rebecca. So the first thing to do is to vision your human rights, to figure out why it is that you feel like it's necessary to take a human rights approach. For us at the National Law Center, back in 1996, our executive director participated in the UN Habitat II conference, actually at the invitation of the Clinton administration at that time. And when she was there, she realized, seeing the other advocates from around the globe who are advocating for housing as a human right, and actually ending up being opposed to the Clinton administration's approach there, who were arguing that housing was not a human right and should not be included as such in the outcome document for that meeting, she realized that it wouldn't be until we actually looked at housing as a human right in this country that we would be able to achieve our mission at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty of ending and preventing homelessness in the U.S. So from that point on, we determined that we would use these standards and talk about housing as a human right to help push us towards that day when we can end and prevent homelessness. Go ahead to the next slide. So the next step in that process was to lay our base. Through national and regional and local trainings, we have helped to educate thousands of lawyers, local advocates, and directly affected people and government officials across the country on the human right to housing, on the standards, on the mechanisms, and even as we progressed through the early 2000s and the mid-2000s under the Bush administration, we were laying that base, creating a cadre of educated and informed citizens across the country who were thinking about housing as a human right and were beginning to use it as part of their advocacy. Go ahead. The next step is to actually use the standards. And so as we were producing our reports, the kinds of things that we would normally do as part of our advocacy, or filing our cases in court situations, putting out press releases, we were making references to these international standards. It wasn't the only thing we were doing, but it complemented the materials that we had in our reports. And we were doing this for a long time with very little visible progress that we could see being made at least coming from the administration. But then in beginning around 2010, we began to see references to human rights emerging in some of the federal reports around housing and homelessness. And in fact, in 2012, we got the language that I've highlighted on the screen here, where the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, together with the Department of Justice, put out a report where they actually cited, in addition to the criminalization of homelessness, in addition to violating domestic law, it could also violate international human rights law, specifically the Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, two of the human rights treaties that we have signed and ratified. And we know that this language wouldn't have gone into this report were it not part of our advocacy. And in fact, the citations that the footnotes that they give in their report are directly to our materials where we had included those materials. So just the simple fact that we consistently and persistently kept on including those as part of our advocacy eventually did pay off with this recognition, the first recognition that we're aware of any domestic agency referring to any domestic practice as an international treaty rights violation. Part of that, besides including it in our reports, was as part of the previous step, the laying the base. At all of the trainings that we were holding, we were educating, we were inviting public officials, federal and state and local government officials to our trainings to present, but not only to share what they had to say, but actually just so they would have to hear for an hour and a half panel other people talking about housing as a human right, and so they began to absorb it, and it ended up producing this kind of result, as I said, in 2012. Head to the next. So in addition to using the standards in our reports, we were trying to further the standards at the international level by drafting shadow reports, drafting the kind of reports that Josh mentioned in his previous section that are due on September 1st. And we generated additional language that we could use in our advocacy, so making the broad standards of the treaties specific to our work. So, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says that cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and torture are prohibited, but we got an observation from the Human Rights Committee that oversees that treaty that says that criminalization of homelessness, the criminally punishing people for doing basic human activities such as sleeping, eating, even going to the bathroom outdoors when there is no private indoor alternative for them to do that, is cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And then we've got that broad language, made it specific to our issues, and then have been able to use that in our domestic advocacy going forward. We've also used processes like the Universal Periodic Review, which we're going into to help generate some of that language as well. But that's kind of the new and novel piece of this for a lot of people, but really where the rubber hits the road is using these mechanisms as an opportunity to have further conversations with our domestic officials. So go ahead to the next slide.
Eric?
Yeah?
Hi, it's Rachel. I just wanted to remind folks, if you are not speaking and your phone is not muted, to please mute your phone. I believe you can do that with *6. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay, thanks. Looks like a slide is missing here. That's okay. The next slide should have been talking about using the mechanisms domestically. And that's how we've made a lot of progress recently. based on the last round of the Universal Periodic Review in 2010, there were a number of consultations across the country where not only representatives from the State Department attended, but representatives from HUD, from Health and Human Services, from the Education Department, from the Department of Justice. All these domestic agencies attended these consultations. So at that point, we knew there was at least one person in those different agencies, and often multiple people, who wouldn't look at us like we were crazy when we were talking about our issues as human rights issues to them. And we built on those relationships. When international experts came to the U.S. either to do mission visits as several special rapporteurs on the right to housing, on the right to water and sanitation, on different rights, came to the U.S. to do official mission visits, and also when some of these officials simply came to the U.S. To visit the UN headquarters in New York City to present some of their materials, we would invite them to Washington, D.C., hold a meeting between them and ourselves, but also invite some of the relevant federal officials who we had identified through the process, and just, again, continue to familiarize these public officials with the idea that our issues are human rights issues, that these international standards exist at the international level, and that they are relevant to the work that we are doing and the work that they are doing, and just continuously reinforcing that concept, using those international opportunities to spur conversations that we could have you can always have a meeting with government officials, but we were doing something new and different and special because we were keying them into these international processes, and that's helped us make progress that we wouldn't have otherwise. So, for example, with the most recent review under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we used the opportunity to have a conversation about criminalization of homelessness with the Department of Justice, Interagency Council on Homelessness, HUD, Health and Human Services, Veterans Administration, several of these different groups, and we made that review an opportunity for us to get all of these agencies concentrated on the issue of criminalization of homelessness, which is an important thing that crosses across all of their agencies, but is none of their primary responsibilities. But we got them to focus on it for an hour-and-a-half meeting, and then we presented them with specific policy requests that we hadn't been able to achieve through our normal domestic policy advocacy avenues. In addition to that, we are building complementary standards. So as this slide here shows, the American Bar Association passed a resolution last year resolving that it recognizes housing as a human right and urging the U.S. to do more to implement it. We got a similar resolution at the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which is the governing body for state and local human rights commissions. Several cities have passed resolutions recognizing housing as a human right. So we're generating all of this other language that we can use strategically to help support our work, our actual legislative and regulatory work at the federal and state and local levels. And it's really just up to us how creative we want to be in creating those standards and using them as part of our advocacy. Go ahead, Rebecca. Here's the slide on using the mechanisms domestically. In addition to some of those other things that I was mentioning, here you can see a picture from one of the UPR consultations, as well as a news article about how some of our colleagues in Sacramento were able to use the visit of an international human rights expert on water and sanitation to press for recognition of some of their issues at the local level. Go ahead. The next thing is to follow up, follow up, follow up. And basically this means that the real work of doing this advocacy doesn't happen in Geneva. It's not going to happen next week at the consultation that's happening in Washington, D.C. Those are important occasions to make contacts, to familiarize some of the government officials with your issues. But often it's, your issue will be one of about 30 that's presented that day to a group of officials, maybe one or two of whom are relevant to doing something on your issue, but most of whom are not. So then it's up to you to not just wait for the government to invite you to a consultation, but for you to follow up with those government officials and through emails, through phone, through in-person meetings, make those appointments, follow up with them, and continue to focus them more and more specifically on the actual things that you want them to do in keeping with the international human rights standards. I think this is the area that we as advocates need the most work in, but it's why I think we at the National Law Center have had the success that we have had. It's just been our persistence in having those follow-up meetings. Go ahead. The next step is to document your own success to make more success. So anytime we had one of these meetings, we were blogging about it. We were trying to do press releases. We even, in one case, when the U.S. Interagency Council report that I was discussing before came out, we sent it to some of our colleagues at the UN level, some of the special rapporteurs, the UN experts on the right to housing, on extreme poverty, and the right to water and sanitation, and we got them to issue their own press release which commended the U.S. So when the U.S. does good things, not just bad things, when they do good things, we have to give them positive reinforcement, say, you get recognition for this. So we would get that. We got that press release. We put it in a blog. We put it in our emails. I sent emails with the press release linked to all of our contacts at HUD, at the Department of Justice, at the Department of State, saying, look, when you do something good, you will get recognized for it. We're not just here to name, shame, and blame you. And, it's this positive reinforcement that I think has helped us make as much progress as we have. And in this slide that's showing here, this represents some of that kind of echo chamber that we've helped create. It's discussing a meeting that was held at the Department of Justice with their Office of Violence Against Women, where we and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, who's begun to really use this language of housing as a human right, we were invited specifically to talk about how this federal agency was incorporating human rights into its own advocacy, and then share that with others at the Department of Justice and in some of the other agencies so that they could begin to do the same. And so we've taken this small kernel of success that we've been able to start with, and we're expanding it out to other agencies, like I said, creating that echo chamber and reinforcing the positive things that the government's doing as much as we are calling them out on the negative aspects. Go ahead. This slide should be saying make the rights real. This means, again, taking those broad international standards and making them very specific. So, for example, the document on the left side of the screen is the recommendations that we made as part of our advocacy under the International Covenant on political rights, very specific, going agency by agency, discussing how, specific policies we wanted them to change, specific practices we wanted them to adopt. And, for example, one of those is taking the funding application for local homeless continuums of care to get funding from the federal government, and including a question on criminalization of homelessness as part of that, so that communities would be incentivized not to criminalize homelessness because it could threaten some of their funding streams. This is an ask that we've had for a long time from the federal government. We haven't been successful in getting them to move on that, but as part of this most recent round of advocacy under the Human Rights Committee review, we were able to get them to agree to this. So hopefully by this fall, a new question will come in on the funding application, and that's the way we are taking this broad, abstract language of international human rights, and we are turning it into actual real policy that's going to help change the way people experience their rights at the very local level on the streets across the U.S. And the web shot, the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen shows some of the success that we've had. This is the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness's webpage on human rights. Again, this is a domestic agency that has a specific page dedicated to human rights, and they've adopted one of our the first recommendation that we had on our recommendations on the left side of the screen, which is to actually recognize and support housing as a human right. On the right side of the screen, you can see that they have actually adopted that language. Housing is a human right. This is something that up until this point, the administration, both Democratic and Republican, neither of them were willing to say, but now we have gotten them to say it. And saying it is that, saying it without supporting it in actual policy is not enough, but saying it is the first step that lays the basis for us to do the subsequent advocacy to actually make the rights real. Go ahead to the next slide. And then the last step is to actually hold the government accountable. So every year we put out a report card on the human right to housing, grading the U.S. on their performance, and you can see from some of the grades on here that we don't grade them too well, and we are continuing to advocate for more. As we develop these standards, we are holding them accountable, not letting the rights that we've created through our advocacy in Geneva simply stay paper promises in Geneva, but bringing them back, making them specific to our issues, and ensuring that what's been promised in Geneva gets translated all the way down to the streets all across the country. So I'm happy to answer some more questions at the end of the presentation after Mary finishes up. But this is kind of a brief taste of how we've taken some of this international stuff that seems all bright and flashy and abstract and difficult, but have made it a very concrete part of our advocacy as we've been working towards a U.S. where housing is a human right. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was really wonderful. So next up is Mary from the Vermont Workers Center. And this is one last slide with Eric's contact information.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us on this call, and I'm really pleased to be able to participate in it because I find the UPR process particularly exciting. The Vermont Workers Center, just as a little background, is a grassroots organization. We have been particularly involved in, of course, workers' rights, but also in the human right to health care. And I've seen how for our grassroots membership, it is really empowering for folks to know that, in fact, there is a human right to health care, or there are rights for laborers who are excluded workers under our current U.S. labor laws. So from that standpoint, our task force is trying to encourage everybody, whether you're a large national organization who has already been doing work in the international mechanisms, or whether you're a small grassroots organization, and I can say that because, as you know, Vermont is a small state. Whether you're a small grassroots organization and wanting to find another method to have your stories heard and your voices heard on an international level, and maybe bring that home to empower people and know that other countries are hearing their voices. And to that end, I would like to encourage everyone to join or lead a UPR working group. Now, I do want to specify that at the beginning of the call, Josh was talking about working groups that the UN has set up. And these are, of course, our working groups, not the same working groups that you might have heard about before. So these are the civil society working groups that the United States Human Rights Network is helping us to form. And those working groups are not yet cast in stone, but we do expect by the 16th of this month to have a comprehensive list. One of the really important things about the working groups is that obviously it helps us to be on a team for a particular issue. And as you know, in the UPR, we're talking about a lot of rights that don't necessarily come up in some of the ratified treaties, like the ICCPR or the CAT or the CERD. So we're talking about things such as healthcare, religion, education, in addition to the criminal justice and the discrimination and the things that are in the other mechanisms. So I know everybody's really busy right now because they are working on these other mechanisms, but it's really a very short step from taking your report for those mechanisms and converting it to a UPR submission. And to that end, we will be sending out soon a template for anyone who feels like they would like some reference points of what to put in. These reports are shorter. Each person or organization that is submitting is actually allowed a short report and a 5-page report. And if you're submitting a report that is joined in by more than one organization or individual, then you're allowed a little bit more lengthy report of 10 pages. And so it'll be up to the individual working groups whether they want to submit one or more reports. But the fact is that by grouping people together in issue areas, we're hoping that when it comes to the actual advocacy portion of our UPR work, whether that's here domestically or whether it's in Geneva, that each of the working groups, having worked together all this time on these issues, will understand their allies' issues as well, so that if there is more than one submission produced by a working group, we'll all understand each other's positions. And when we go to lobby a country, we can make sure that all of our joint positions are presented. We can exchange amongst working groups our 1 or 2 sheet summaries of what the points are that we want that country to ask about or hopefully demand of the United States in terms of action on the ground and at home. So the working groups are basically a living thing. And obviously for the purposes of organization, we need to have some sort of preliminary division. So the task force will be finalizing that, as I said, by the 16th. Some of the issue areas have to do with the economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. So there is education, there is environmental rights, there is health, there are economic rights, And of course, there are the other categories. There are indigenous people's rights. There are criminal justice rights, access to justice system rights. And obviously all of these rights are interdependent because they are human rights, and no single one of them can stand alone ever. However, by separating it out into groups, we're hoping that it will promote a more joint approach and a consolidated front to anyone who is opposing the human rights. So the working groups will work together. They will advocate with the UN member states to let them know about the issue areas. And each working group will have two co-leads or co-chairs, whatever word we want to use for it, who will be responsible for the facilitation of that working group's meetings and setting up their schedule for meetings, etc. Everybody has the same schedule on one thing, and that is that our reports are due to the network by September 1st, 2014. This is why we're going to try and get the working group settled. I don't want anyone to think that that means that an organization or individual can't join a working group or suggest a working group once we've already started going, because that is going to happen. And I know during the ICCPR review that happened, and it worked out quite well. And the working groups, I think, would all say that overall there was a lot of success due to the fact that our working groups were so cohesive. So I'm actually going to, I think that's enough of a summary about the working groups. I want to encourage everyone to join the listserv, and that's on the slide, and to get involved in a working group, and we look forward to your participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you again, Eric and Joshua. We now have time for questions. And so in order to ask your question, there's a few ways you can go about it. If you are listening on your computer, you can raise your hand, and you do that by going to the little button on the top right that says My Mood, and you raise your hand. You can also type in a question in the chat portion, or if you're on the phone, you can press *6 to unmute yourself. If you do unmute yourself on your phone, it isn't possible to mute back in with the Any Meeting function, so you'll have to just mute yourself with your phone's mute function. So please, if anyone has any questions, go ahead. And sometimes it takes a moment for the raise your hand function to work.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. And please say your name and what organization you're from.
Susan Scott from the National Lawyers Guild. And I'm just wondering, what should we do about our 2010 reports that did not get into the record? Things like ratification of economic, social, and cultural rights treaties and things like that. Should we just kind of rework them and resubmit them? Since, absolutely no progress has been made on them.
This is Mary, and if I might address that briefly before Eric and Josh do as well, I would suggest that maybe it could be updated with some current on-the-ground information of how the continuing failure of the government to ratify that treaty perpetuates human rights abuses in the past 4 years.
So mainly we are focusing on the last 4 years and stuff that's happened in the last 4 years.
Well, I wouldn't suggest that you only focus on that, but I think that if what you're talking about, reworking your report, I would try and add new material. I think in the Civil Society Guide, there's actually, under some of the newer supplements, I think there is actually something that says they really want to know, what's happened in the last 4 years, to make it even more important that your issue get brought forward.
That should be easy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
This is Eric. Just to complement that, I think, if the issue is something that was recognized as one of the recommendations or a question that was raised in the previous UPR that hasn't had any domestic action on it, then obviously that's the correct approach. Is you give them the update to say nothing's happened, and while you're crafting this report for submission to the UN, you have to be thinking about what are you doing in order to use that process as part of your advocacy domestically. So how are you letting the government know that they are going to be held accountable for not making the progress that they should have over the past 4 years? And whether that's directed, at the federal, state, or local level, legislative or executive branches, your strategies will be a little different for each. But in terms of, something like ratification of the economic and social rights treaties, that's something that Congress needs to do. The executive branch has a role. It's a very long shot given our current Congress, but the administration should at least be promoting that as a possibility for a long-term campaign. They have worked on trying to get some of the treaties around which they hoped there would be more consensus. The Disability Rights Treaty and the Women's Rights Treaties passed over the past couple of years, and those were supposed to kind of start the ball rolling. Even those were stonewalled. So, they could argue that they at least had a strategy, and the beginning of their strategy didn't work. So that's where they are now. But I think beyond just getting that treaty ratified, they could be doing more, across health and human services, for example, to talk about healthcare as a human right, or in the education department to talk about education as a human right. So, approaching it as if we had ratified the treaty, even though, that hasn't actually gone through Congress. So I think things like that could be the way you could approach it. Now, if it's an issue that wasn't picked up in the last round of the UPR as a question or recommendation that any of the governments made to the U.S., then you have a different kind of advocacy strategy. You need to, look at not only updating your materials, but really retargeting your advocacy, trying to figure out what country might be interested in talking about your issue, and then doing advocacy with them, as Josh said, either if you can make it to their missions in Geneva there, or at their embassies in D.C., or in New York City, trying to, or just sending them your reports. There's a lot of the governments that we met with last time said that, when they do receive reports from U.S. groups, they actually do read them and take them into account. So trying to just do very targeted advocacy, figure out who would be likely to raise your issue, and then working with them to make it, as pointed as you can. But, you got to recognize that this is a diplomatic process. It's not the expert reviews of the treaty committees, but It's a process where they're state representatives. They have political relationships with the U.S. That they need to take into account. So you try and make the recommendation worded sharply enough that you can actually do something with it, but gently enough that they don't feel like they're going out on a limb with it, and then it's really, like I said before, it's all follow up. Once you get a recommendation, it's all up to what we are doing to hold those meetings with different agencies or with Congress or whoever needs to have a meeting to actually make those rights real on the ground.
Okay. The other thing that the Guild has done is advocacy, and UPR advocacy in particular, about the U.S. foreign policy and how it affects human rights of people in other countries. So that's also something that, no way are we going to probably make any progress on it, but it's something that really needs to be, part of the process, I think.
Thanks so much.
I agree. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, and thanks for answering. I think Andrew Park from Los Angeles had a question, and you should be unmuted now, Andrew. Andrew, did you have a question? We can't hear you if you're trying to talk. Okay, it seems like Anne isn't able to talk right now. Was there anyone else who had a question? And I'm sorry if I cut. Did someone else want to answer? Joshua, did you have something you wanted to add?
I didn't have much. I think Eric and Mary summarized really well. The one thing I was going to say though is that you can actually, get the language that you're looking for. And one thing we can do, just to, using the UPR info. I think Eric said it really well that, we can match data, but you can see what kind of questions they've asked in the past and then see exactly what they're willing to ask. You say you asked this of the country before, the UK, could you do the similar thing for the United States? So in other webinars, we'll get into it deeper. We'll look at UPR info, and it's a great really inventory of all the rights that were raised and questions that were brought up in the past. So that's all I was going to add, since there's a little pause there.
Thank you, Joshua. I think Andrew has figured out how to unmute himself. So, Andrew, please go ahead if you can.
Thanks. Ta-da! A lot of buttons. All right.
Wonderful.
So somebody had mentioned the Supplemental Civil Society Guidelines. For the 10-page document that you're looking for on September 1st, do we use those, and do we get those from the OHCHR website, or how? Yeah.
Hi, this is Mary, and we expect to be sending out to everybody on the listserv a summary of the OHCHR technical guidelines, which would indicate that if you're an individual or one organization, you have a 5-page report, and if it's a joint submission, it'd be a 10-page report. So I'm sure you couldn't go wrong by using the OHCHR guidelines, and we will also be sending out a synopsis of them. I know that there were a couple of updates just in the last 10 or 11 months to that guide. Josh, Eric, do you have anything else to add?
Thanks, Mary.
Hello?
Andrew, that's the only question you had?
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
Sure.
Joshua, did you want to add something?
No, not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
It's good.
Okay, it seems like we have another question. Eugene Fidel. Eugene, I just unmuted you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. First of all, this is a very helpful webinar, and I appreciate your leadership in doing this. A question about the shadow reports, which I gather get assembled into a sort of compendium after they're submitted to you all.
Yes.
How big a document is that compendium likely to be, do you think? I'm just curious.
I don't recall how big it was last time. Maybe Eric or Josh do.
Yeah, last time it was 400 plus pages was what the network ended up sending to Geneva, and all of that is then boiled down by the UN into a single 10-page document. So yeah, but it was at the time it's fantastic, really. It's just this very concise. In that, each working group of these many working groups was producing just a single, 5 or 10-page report. But, a comprehensive coverage of all of these different human rights issues in the U.S. all together, bound in one place. So for the most part, that nobody really prints out the whole 400 pages as one thing to just sit down and read. But yeah, it was, I believe, 400 plus pages, and it covered all these 26 different working groups I think we had last time. So it was great.
Right, but that's interesting, and it leaves me scratching my head because so much has got to be lost in the process of winnowing several hundred pages into 10. That just really terrifies me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a whole nation's worth of 350 million people and all the human rights abuses that are going on here that's being whittled down to 10 pages on the non-governmental side, 20 pages on the governmental side, and a 3.5-hour review. So it can't possibly really touch deeply on anything, and that's the importance of the working groups, is for us to make our own priorities, is to say, we aren't going to be able to cover every single issue, and so, within criminal justice, within housing, within education, what's the, kind of one or two at the most important things that if nothing else gets mentioned, we would want these things mentioned, and then we put kind of all of our efforts behind that, and that's kind of the way that we approach our advocacy, is not trying to get everything under the sun into this review, but really what's going to be the most strategic, what will help us push our domestic policy ask over the top, what's winnable domestically that we might be able to use this process as part of our advocacy for, and those are the things that we're going to concentrate on.
And also, I think just to supplement that, that's a great explanation. And just to supplement it, I would emphasize what Josh said earlier, which was one of the reasons for compiling our own reports is that we can, in fact, directly send them to a country who is interested in that issue area, and they will read them. So even if that whole thing doesn't get into the 10-page document that the UN winnows down, if the countries that are going to be your advocates and make demands of the United States have that whole report, they'll have more information upon which to base recommendations and questions.
Okay, so that means, thank you. That means that the sort of undistilled reports, the building block reports that folks are going to be submitting by September 1st, can themselves be used as advocacy tools targeted at potentially friendly countries for their use at the face-to-face.
Absolutely. And then one more thing is, it's also going to be on the UN Office of the High Commissioner website.
That's what
so the 10-page report in its full will be available at the website.
Oh, I thought that all the submission reports that go into the ultimate 10-page report also are on the website, right?
Right.
All the reports that we submit, even if they don't get into the ultimate 10-pager, they'll be on that website.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
Yep. Just to clarify that. Yes.
The best part about getting something into that big 10-pager, the UN-produced one, is that one is then translated into the different official UN languages, which is part of the reason that they need so much lead time, why we have to file our reports in September, so that they can consolidate them and translate that by the time the actual review comes around next March. But it's either translating your entire report, or if you wanted to translate just a piece of it, if certain recommendations, create a one-pager or something in Spanish or French or some other language, that might be a strategic thing to do if you think it will help you with a specific country.
And actually, during the ICCPR, That's exactly what we did with our one-pagers when we were lobbying commissioners from certain countries. We had it translated into their native language, and they, although obviously they're perfectly capable of reading and speaking English, they said they appreciated the extra effort that went into that, just as an FYI.
Well, thank you, Eugene, for your question, and thank you for the presenters for answering it. It seems like Alice Dale has a question. Alice, you should be unmuted. Hey, Alice.
Hello, this is Alice Dalla. I'm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I know Rachel from the Amnesty International Women's Human Rights Coordination Group. So hi, Rachel. I have two questions. One of them, is there posted somewhere a list of the issues where there already are organized working groups working on them? And secondly, how did the domestic violence item on the report card you showed get moved up to an A- in 2013?
I can answer the working groups, which is that as for the UPR working groups, no, it's not posted yet, but it will be as of July 16th, and that I'm happy to send out to anybody by email who would like it a draft of that proposal for your input.
Thank you.
And this is Eric responding to the report card item. The 2013 reference was specifically because Congress succeeded in passing the updated Violence Against Women Act, which obviously doesn't do everything and hasn't been fully implemented, but we did feel that we did need to give them credit for that advance and for some of the other work that the administration had done over the previous year. But that was our internal call to recognize that, while recognizing there's still plenty of work to be done, and the report itself that's beneath that, the title page of the report does address some of those things that remain to be done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alice, for your question, and thank you, Eric, and everyone else, Mary, for your answers. Is there anybody else who has any final questions? Doesn't look like there's any other raised hands. Okay. If nobody else has any questions, then thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Rebecca? Hey, it's Rachel. Just before we close, I wanted to thank the folks that called in. We know with the holiday coming up, this is a busy time, so we appreciate you taking the time. I did want to make sure that it was clear that we do have a UPR task force, a Universal Periodic Review Task Force in place, and that Mary and Josh, who have spoken today, are the interim co-chairs of that, and that Eric is also our other speaker, a member. Several of the task force members I know have been on the phone. So I just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. You can see the list of the task force members on the website. And I just wanted to also reiterate several things that others have said on the phone. We will be sending out some communications in the next couple of weeks with the list of the working groups, like Mary mentioned, with a template that we hope might make it easier for folks that are currently drafting reports for CERD or CAT, or drafted reports or were involved in drafting reports for ICCPR, to make it kind of an easier transition, I guess, for a UPR report. We also want you guys to let others know about the process, folks that you work with, your colleagues, your collaborators. Ask them, point them to our website so that they can sign up for the listserv. This is another plug. If you're not on the UPR listserv, please sign up for it. Again, you can get to it from the website. It'll be a really important means of communication for us. over the next year and a half while we work on it. If you have a question or you know you're planning to write a report or you want to be involved in report writing that's specific to some issues, send us an email at upr@ushhrnetwork.org, upr@ushhrnetwork.org, to let us know any questions, also to let us know, what you're interested in, what you're planning to work on. We've also mentioned some resources like the Civil Society Guide. We didn't mention kind of a general frequently asked questions or a short about the UPR process. We will be producing a couple of resources that we'll distribute and also make available on the website. So I just wanted to kind of make some plugs about those things at the end of the call. And again, thank Josh, Mary, and Eric for taking the time and making wonderful presentations and for all the great work they're doing. Thank the rest of you, and thank Rebecca for kind of pitching in to facilitate when I was muted early on in the call. And for those of you that stuck in while we worked through some mute-unmute issues at the very beginning of the call. But with that, Rebecca, I turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Rachel, for organizing, and thank you again, everyone, for participating, and thank you to Josh and Mary and Eric, and please do join the UPR listserv if you haven't already, so you can get involved, and we will be sending around a recording of this webinar so people can reference it. So without further ado, thank you, everyone, very much, and have a wonderful holiday weekend. Take care. Goodbye.
Aloha. Bye.